Ma'am,
You're
you're
flagged
flagged in our system. You're not allowed to fly.
What? That's impossible. There
The
must be
gate
some
agent's
mistake.
words cut through the busy airport like a knife.
Ma'am,
Sarah Mitchell stood frozen at the counter,
you're
her
flagged
boarding
in our
pass
system.
rejected, her name lighting up red on the screen. Around her, passengers
Ma'am.
whispered and stared.
Ma'am, you're
They
flagged
didn't
in our
know her
system.
name meant something extraordinary to the pilots flying F-22 Raptors 30,000 feet above. They were about to find out. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Chicago O'Hare International Airport as thousands of travelers moved through the crowded terminal like a human river flowing toward their destinations. Sarah Mitchell stood in line at gate B-17, her small carry-on bag at her feet, wearing simple jeans and a black jacket that made her look like any other passenger heading to Los Angeles on the 9 a.m. flight. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her calm eyes watched the boarding process with the patient stillness of someone who had waded through much worse than airport lines. She was 42 years old, fit and lean with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced real danger and survived, though nothing about her appearance suggested the extraordinary life she had lived before everything fell apart. When Sarah reached the gate counter and handed her boarding pass to the agent, she expected the usual quick scan and polite smile that preceded the walk down the jet bridge. Instead, the agent's scanner beeped 3 times in rapid succession, a harsh electronic sound that made the woman's friendly expression vanish instantly. The agent frowned at her computer screen, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard as she pulled up additional information, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten with the familiar dread that had become part of her life over the past 18 months. She knew what was coming before the agent even looked up with suspicious eyes that had transformed from welcoming to hostile in seconds. "Ma'am, I need to see your identification," the agent said, her voice now sharp and official, carrying across the gate area loud enough that nearby passengers turned to look at the developing situation. Sarah pulled out her driver's license with steady hands and placed it on the counter, maintaining the dignified composure she had learned to wear like armor against the judgment and questions that followed her everywhere. The agent compared the photo to Sarah's face, then typed more information into the computer, her expression growing more severe with each passing second as databases revealed information that transformed Sarah from ordinary passenger to flagged security risk. "Ms. Mitchell, according to our system, you've been placed on a federal aviation restriction list," the agent announced, speaking loudly enough that everyone within 20 feet could hear every word clearly. "You're prohibited from flying on commercial aircraft due to regulatory violations and safety concerns. I'm going to need to call a supervisor and airport security." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her, passengers backing away slightly as if she might be dangerous, parents pulling their children closer while businessmen whispered to each other about what kind of person gets banned from flying entirely. Sarah kept her face neutral even as humiliation burned in her chest, even as she wanted to shout the truth about why she was really on that list, even as every fiber of her being wanted to defend herself against the assumptions she could see forming in the minds of everyone watching this public confrontation. But she said nothing. She had learned the hard way that explaining only made things worse, that the truth was classified at levels most people couldn't access, that her side of the story was buried under national security restrictions that prevented her from ever clearing her name in any meaningful way. So she stood silently while the supervisor arrived, while airport security officers approached with hands near their weapons, while fellow passengers recorded the scene on their phones assuming they were witnessing the removal of someone who had threatened flight safety or committed some terrible aviation crime. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Brian Foster, the gate supervisor," a man in a dark suit said as he positioned himself between Sarah and the growing crowd of onlookers. "Can you explain why you're attempting to board this flight when you've been explicitly banned from commercial aviation?" His tone carried the automatic suspicion of someone dealing with a rule breaker, someone who thought restrictions didn't apply to them, someone who needed to be stopped before they caused problems at 35,000 feet. Sarah met his eyes steadily and spoke in a quiet voice that only he and the nearby security officers could hear clearly. "I'm trying to get to Los Angeles for my mother's funeral," she said simply, offering no excuses or explanations about the ban itself, refusing to play the game of defending herself against charges she couldn't legally discuss. "I was told I could apply for a one-time travel exemption for emergency family situations. I submitted all the paperwork 3 weeks ago through the proper channels. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder containing approval letters, medical documents about her mother's death, and the official exemption that had taken her lawyer 6 weeks to obtain through channels that most people didn't even know existed. Brian examined the documents with the careful scrutiny of someone who had dealt with forged papers before, checking reference numbers against his tablet and making phone calls to verification departments that could confirm whether these approvals were legitimate. The security officers stood close to Sarah, ready to escort her out if the paperwork proved false, their presence making it clear she was considered a potential threat despite her calm demeanor and cooperation. Other passengers whispered theories about what she might have done. Maybe she had tried to open an emergency exit mid-flight, maybe she had assaulted crew members, maybe she had been caught with weapons or drugs, the speculation growing more dramatic with each retelling as people filled in blanks with their worst assumptions. After 20 minutes of verification calls and database checks, Brian finally nodded slowly and handed the documents back to Sarah with an expression that remained suspicious despite confirmation that her exemption was valid. "Your paperwork checks out," he admitted reluctantly, as if disappointed he couldn't simply deny her boarding and end this complication. "You're approved for this one flight only, under strict conditions. You'll board last, you'll be seated in the back of the aircraft under crew observation, and any deviation from normal passenger behavior will result in immediate landing and your arrest. Do you understand these terms?" Sarah nodded silently, accepting the humiliating conditions because getting to her mother's funeral mattered more than her pride, because she had already lost everything else and couldn't lose this final chance to say goodbye. The other passengers boarded while Sarah waited by the gate counter like a criminal under guard, watching families and business travelers file past while some stared at her with open curiosity and others deliberately looked away as if she might be contagious. A little girl asked her mother loudly why that lady couldn't fly on planes, and the mother shushed her quickly while pulling her daughter away from Sarah as if proximity to someone on a no-fly list might somehow be dangerous. Sarah felt the familiar ache of injustice, the burning awareness that everyone judging her had no idea who she really was, what she had done for her country, what she had sacrificed in ways they would never understand because the missions remained classified even now. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Sarah Mitchell had once been Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell, one of the most decorated fighter pilots in United States Air Force history, a woman who had flown combat missions in 3 different war zones, who had commanded tactical operations that saved thousands of lives, who had test-piloted experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what humans and machines could achieve together. Her call sign, Phoenix, had been legendary among military aviators, representing someone who could bring dying aircraft back from impossible situations, who could complete missions that other pilots said couldn't be done, who had earned the respect of every fighter pilot who ever shared airspace with her, including the elite warriors who flew the F-22 Raptor, the most advanced air superiority fighter ever built. But 18 months ago, everything had changed during a classified mission over hostile territory that Sarah still couldn't discuss with anyone outside secure government facilities. She had made a split-second tactical decision that saved her entire squadron from an ambush but violated direct orders from commanders who were watching the situation through satellite feeds thousands of miles away, commanders who didn't understand the reality on the ground, who saw the mission through politics rather than survival. Her decision had worked, everyone came home alive when they should have died, but it had embarrassed powerful people who didn't like being proven wrong, who didn't appreciate subordinates making command decisions even when those decisions saved lives. The investigation that followed had been brutal and political, with Sarah accused of reckless endangerment, insubordination, and violating rules of engagement even though her actions had been tactically sound and morally necessary. The military couldn't court-martial her without revealing classified mission details they wanted buried, so instead they had forced her into early retirement with a record that made it impossible for her to fly commercially, that flagged her name in every aviation database, that banned her from the skies she had protected for 20 years. The official reason listed regulatory violations and safety concerns, vague language that destroyed her career without revealing the truth, language that made her look dangerous when she had actually been too good at her job for people who valued politics over results. Finally, after every other passenger had boarded, Brian gestured for Sarah to proceed down the jet bridge under the escort of a security officer who walked directly behind her as if she might try to run or cause problems. She moved down the narrow tunnel connecting the terminal to the aircraft, her footsteps echoing in the enclosed space, her mind full of memories of walking toward fighter jets on military airfields where her presence had meant respect rather than suspicion. The flight attendants at the aircraft door watched her board with tight expressions, clearly briefed about the flagged passenger they needed to monitor, their professional smiles strained as they directed her toward the rear of the cabin where she had been assigned a seat in the very last row next to the lavatories. Sarah settled into seat 38F and buckled her seatbelt, ignoring the curious stares from passengers who had watched her humiliating boarding process, ignoring the flight attendant who positioned herself nearby with arms crossed in obvious surveillance mode. Through the small window, she could see ground crew preparing the Boeing 737 for departure, their movements efficient and practiced as they disconnected the jet bridge and signaled the pilots that everything was ready. The aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, joining the line of departing flights in the endless rhythm of commercial aviation that moved millions of people across the sky every single day without most of them ever thinking about the complexity involved. The captain's voice came through the speaker system with the standard welcome announcement, introducing himself as Captain James Rodriguez with First Officer Kelly Martinez, noting their flight time of 3 hours and 42 minutes to Los Angeles with good weather expected and an on-time arrival. Sarah listened with the trained ear of someone who had made thousands of such announcements herself in military aircraft, noting the calm professionalism in Rodriguez's voice that suggested experience and competence. She had no reason to think this flight would be anything other than routine, no indication that in less than an hour everything would change in ways that would force everyone aboard to see her as something very different than a banned passenger. The takeoff was smooth and uneventful, the 737 climbing steadily into the clear morning sky as Chicago disappeared beneath them and the Midwest stretched out below in a patchwork of farms and small towns connected by highways that looked like thin threads from this altitude. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to relax, tried to focus on the upcoming funeral and the grief she hadn't fully processed yet, tried not to think about how it felt to be just a passenger in an aircraft when she had spent 20 years commanding machines that could break the sound barrier and defeat any threat in the sky. The irony wasn't lost on her, she was banned from flying yet surrounded by people who had no idea she could probably fly this 737 better than the pilots in the cockpit, who didn't know her thousands of flight hours made most commercial pilots look like beginners. 30 minutes into the flight, as they cruised at 37,000 feet over Iowa, Sarah sensed something change in the cabin atmosphere before she understood what was wrong. The flight attendants were moving with sudden urgency, speaking into their handsets with concerned expressions, and the smooth drone of the engine seemed to falter slightly in a way that most passengers wouldn't notice but that made Sarah's trained instincts immediately alert. She sat up straighter and looked around carefully, trying to assess the situation without causing alarm, her military training automatically activated by subtle signs that something wasn't right even though she had no official role or authority on this aircraft. Then the captain's voice returned to the speaker system, but this time the calm professionalism was gone, replaced by barely controlled stress that made every passenger suddenly stop their conversations and movies to listen carefully. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We're experiencing a serious medical emergency in the cockpit. First Officer Martinez has become unconscious, and I'm not feeling well myself. We're declaring an emergency and requesting immediate assistance. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from the flight attendants. The announcement ended abruptly, and the cabin erupted in worried conversations as passengers realized something was terribly wrong, as parents grabbed their children and nervous travelers demanded explanations from flight attendants who looked as frightened as everyone else. Sarah's mind immediately shifted into tactical assessment mode, processing information and calculating options with the speed that had made her such an effective combat pilot. If both pilots were incapacitated, possibly from carbon monoxide poisoning, cabin pressure issues, or food contamination, then this aircraft full of civilians was in extreme danger with potentially no one qualified to land it safely. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, moving toward the front of the cabin where the lead flight attendant was frantically communicating with someone on her handset, probably trying to reach the cockpit or coordinate with ground control about what to do next. "I can help," Sarah said firmly to the flight attendant, a young woman named Jessica whose name tag showed 5 years of service but whose terrified eyes suggested she had never faced anything like this situation. I'm a pilot with extensive experience. I need to get into that cockpit immediately. Jessica looked at her with suspicion mixed with desperate hope, clearly remembering that Sarah was the flagged passenger who had boarded under restrictions, the woman who was banned from flying and supposedly dangerous, but also recognizing that if the pilots were dying then maybe any help was better than none. "You're on the restriction list," Jessica said, her voice shaking. "I can't just let you into the cockpit. I don't even know if you're really a pilot or if this is some kind of trick." Sarah understood the hesitation, understood that Jessica was following procedures that said never trust a flagged passenger, never believe claims without verification, never open the secure cockpit door except in verified emergencies. But they were running out of time, and if Captain Rodriguez lost consciousness too then everyone on this aircraft would die when it ran out of fuel or crashed into the ground with no one able to control it. "Call air traffic control," Sarah said urgently, speaking quickly but calmly to avoid causing more panic among passengers who were now crowding the aisles trying to understand what was happening. "Tell them you have a passenger named Sarah Mitchell who is offering assistance. Ask them to check military aviation databases. My call sign was Phoenix. They'll know who I am." Jessica hesitated for one more second, then grabbed her handset and made the call, explaining the situation to controllers on the ground who had already been alerted to Flight 237's emergency and were scrambling resources to help. Meanwhile, in the skies above Iowa, 2 F-22 Raptor fighter jets had been scrambled from Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska as part of the emergency response protocol for aircraft in distress over American airspace. The Raptors screamed through the sky at supersonic speeds, their advanced sensors already locked onto Flight 237's position and trajectory, their pilots ready to provide visual assessment and communication relay if needed. Major Jake "Hawkeye" Harrison led the two-ship formation, his 15 years of fighter experience making him one of the Air Force's most respected F-22 pilots, while his wingman Captain Lisa "Razor" Chung flew close formation with the precision that had made her a rising star in the fighter community. As the F-22s approached Flight 237's altitude and position, air traffic control provided them with all available information about the emergency including the passenger manifest that had been uploaded to military databases for security screening. "Hawkeye, be advised we have a passenger aboard Flight 237 who is offering pilot assistance," the controller said over the secure radio frequency. "Passenger name is Sarah Mitchell, formerly Captain Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, flagged in civilian aviation systems but showing extensive military flight hours in our databases. Can you confirm identity and advise if she should be permitted cockpit access?" There was absolute silence on the radio for 3 full seconds as Major Harrison processed that name, as the call sign Phoenix registered in his mind with the force of an explosion. His hand tightened on the control stick as memories flooded back, stories he had heard from older pilots about legendary missions, a name spoken with reverence in fighter squadrons, someone he had never met personally but whose reputation was known to every F-22 pilot in the Air Force. "Say again," Harrison transmitted, his voice carrying shock and disbelief. "Did you say Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell is aboard that aircraft?" "Affirmative, Hawkeye," the controller confirmed. "She's flagged as restricted from commercial aviation but is offering assistance. Advise whether we should permit her access to the cockpit given the current emergency." Harrison exchanged glances with his wingman through the cockpit canopy even though they were separated by hundreds of feet, both of them understanding the significance of this moment, both knowing that if Phoenix Mitchell was offering to help then that aircraft had just gained the most qualified emergency pilot they could possibly have. "Controller, this is Hawkeye," Harrison transmitted, and his voice now carried absolute certainty and profound respect. "Phoenix Mitchell is cleared for immediate cockpit access with full authority. She's not just qualified, she's one of the best tactical aviators this country has ever produced. If anyone can save that aircraft, it's her. Tell the crew to give her whatever she needs and follow her instructions without question." The radio transmission was being recorded and broadcast to multiple channels including the frequency monitored by Flight 237, and Jessica the flight attendant heard every word through her handset, heard the reverence in Major Harrison's voice when he spoke Sarah's call sign, heard the absolute confidence and respect that transformed Sarah from suspicious band passenger to recognized hero in the span of seconds. Jessica's face showed complete shock as she looked at Sarah with new eyes, as she realized the woman she had been monitoring as a potential threat was actually someone that elite F-22 pilots spoke about with the kind of respect usually reserved for legends and heroes. "You're Phoenix," Jessica whispered, the call sign obviously meaning something even to a civilian flight attendant, perhaps from news stories or military coverage she had seen. "The Phoenix? Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Sarah shook her head slightly, maintaining her composed expression even as vindication and sadness mixed in her chest. "It wouldn't have mattered," she said quietly. "My name is flagged in your systems. The ban is real even if it's unjust. But none of that matters now. What matters is getting everyone home safely. Open the cockpit door." Jessica immediately entered the security code and pushed open the heavy reinforced door that had been designed to keep out terrorists and hijackers, revealing the cramped cockpit where Captain Rodriguez slumped in his seat struggling to stay conscious while First Officer Martinez lay completely unconscious in the right seat, her head rolled to the side and her breathing shallow. Sarah moved into the cockpit with the confident speed of someone who had entered thousands of aircraft, immediately assessing the situation and prioritizing actions with the tactical decision-making that had saved lives in combat zones around the world. She checked both pilots quickly, confirming that Martinez was unconscious but breathing while Rodriguez was fading fast, his skin pale and his movements sluggish as whatever had affected them continued to worsen. "Get them oxygen immediately," Sarah ordered Jessica, who rushed to retrieve portable oxygen bottles from emergency equipment storage. "And find out if any passengers have medical training. We need to figure out what's causing this." While Jessica coordinated medical assistance, Sarah slid into the left seat that Rodriguez had vacated, her hands finding the controls with the automatic familiarity of muscle memory, her eyes scanning the instrument panel and flight management systems with practiced efficiency. The Boeing 737 was flying on autopilot, maintaining altitude and heading, all systems showing normal except for subtle indications that the cabin pressurization wasn't working at optimal levels, a malfunction that explained why the pilots were suffering from hypoxia, oxygen deprivation that was slowly killing them while passengers remained unaffected because they were breathing cabin air at different pressure levels. Sarah's hands moved quickly across the controls, first adjusting the cabin pressurization system to emergency override mode, then checking fuel levels and calculating whether they had enough to return to Chicago or should divert to closer airports. She keyed the radio transmit button and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had commanded far more complex aircraft in far more dangerous situations. "Denver Center, this is Flight 237, I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell taking emergency control of this aircraft. Both original pilots are incapacitated from suspected hypoxia due to pressurization malfunction. I'm a qualified pilot with extensive multi-engine experience. Request vectors back to Chicago O'Hare and emergency services standing by." The controller responded immediately, providing heading and altitude assignments while alerting emergency services, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He was coordinating with someone who claimed to be a pilot but whose name showed up in databases as banned from aviation. Then Major Harrison's voice cut through on the radio frequency, the F-22 pilot having switched to the civilian emergency channel so he could communicate directly. "Flight 237, this is Hawkeye leading a flight of 2 Raptors off your right wing. Captain Mitchell, we have visual contact with your aircraft. Phoenix, it's an honor to share airspace with you. You have full tactical authority here. We'll escort you home and provide any assistance you need." The reverence in Harrison's voice carried through the radio clearly enough that everyone listening understood this wasn't just a routine military assist, this was one exceptional pilot honoring another, this was the elite acknowledging a legend, this was respect earned through years of extraordinary achievement. Sarah felt emotion tighten her throat as she responded, the professional acknowledgement meaning more than Harrison could know after 18 months of being treated like a criminal for doing her job too well. "Copy that, Hawkeye. Good to hear a friendly voice. Stay close and keep me advised of any traffic. We're taking this bird home." Sarah banked the 737 into a gentle turn, beginning the return path toward Chicago while managing the pressurization system and monitoring the incapacitated pilots who were now receiving oxygen and slowly beginning to show signs of recovery. Behind her in the cabin, word was spreading among passengers about what was happening, that the banned woman they had judged and feared was actually a famous military pilot, that F-22 fighters were escorting them because of her, that the name, Phoenix, meant something extraordinary in ways they were only beginning to understand. Passengers pulled out phones and searched online, finding articles about legendary missions, reading about a female Air Force pilot who had become a legend among aviators, discovering the truth about someone they had dismissed as dangerous just an hour earlier. Jessica returned to the cockpit doorway with a retired doctor who had been among the passengers, and together they worked on stabilizing Rodriguez and Martinez while Sarah flew the aircraft with one hand and managed radio communications with the other, coordinating with air traffic control and the F-22 escorts with the smooth efficiency of someone who had conducted far more complex operations. The F-22s maintained close formation off the airliner's wing, their presence both protective and symbolic, Major Harrison and Captain Chong understanding without being told that they were witnessing something historically significant, Phoenix Mitchell returning to the sky despite the ban that had tried to ground her, proving that true capability couldn't be suppressed by unjust regulations. As they approached Chicago airspace, Sarah coordinated the descent and approach with the precision that came from thousands of hours in far more demanding aircraft. Her commands clear and professional as she brought the heavy airliner down through the clouds toward O'Hare's runways where emergency vehicles were already positioned. The F-22s peeled off to maintain high cover as Flight 237 entered the airport traffic pattern, Harrison transmitting a final message that carried emotion unusual for professional military communications. "Phoenix, you were magnificent. The Air Force misses you. The country misses you. Welcome back to the sky." Sarah blinked back tears as she focused on the landing, configuring the aircraft for approach while Rodriguez recovered enough to assist from the right seat even though he was still weak and disoriented. The runway appeared ahead through the windscreen, the white centerline stretching toward them as Sarah made final adjustments to speed and glide path, her hands and feet working the controls with practiced grace. The 737 touched down smoothly on the runway, the main gear kissing the concrete with barely a bump, and Sarah deployed the thrust reversers and brakes to slow the aircraft to taxi speed while passengers erupted in applause and tears, understanding that they had just been saved by someone extraordinary. As the aircraft rolled to a stop surrounded by emergency vehicles, Sarah completed the shutdown procedures methodically, ensuring every system was properly configured before unbuckling her harness and standing up from the seat where she had just saved over 100 lives. Rodriguez looked at her with gratitude and confusion, clearly wondering who this woman was and why she had been flagged in the system as banned. "You're Phoenix Mitchell," he said wonderingly, having heard the radio transmissions and put the pieces together. "You're the one they talk about in flight school. The legend. But why are you on a restriction list? Why were you banned?" Sarah shook her head, unwilling to discuss the classified details even now, even after proving once again that her capabilities were extraordinary. "Politics and bad decisions made by people who valued their pride over truth," she said simply. "But that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is everyone is safe." She moved toward the cabin where passengers stood waiting, their earlier suspicion and judgment completely transformed into awe and gratitude, some crying and others trying to thank her while Jessica stood with tears streaming down her face knowing she had almost prevented this woman from helping because of flags in a computer system. Airport officials and airline executives rushed aboard the aircraft wanting to understand what had happened, their confusion evident when they saw the woman who had been flagged and monitored now being treated as a hero by passengers and crew. But before anyone could ask questions or demand explanations, Major Harrison and Captain Chong arrived in a military vehicle that had raced from the Air Force Base to O'Hare, the two F-22 pilots still wearing their flight suits and helmets as they strode through the airport terminal with purpose. They found Sarah surrounded by grateful passengers and confused officials, and Harrison immediately saluted with perfect military precision, his expression showing profound respect. "Captain Mitchell, Major Jake Harrison, 27th Fighter Squadron," he said formally. "It was an honor to fly with you today. On behalf of every fighter pilot in the United States Air Force, thank you for reminding everyone why you earned that call sign." He lowered his salute and pulled out his phone, making a call that was answered immediately. "Sir, this is Hawkeye. Phoenix Mitchell just saved a commercial airliner full of civilians using skills that prove she should never have been grounded. I'm requesting immediate review of her case and restoration of her flight status. She's too valuable to keep on the ground, and today proved that whatever politics got her banned were wrong." Sarah stood silently as Harrison spoke to someone with authority, probably a general or Pentagon official, arguing her case with passionate conviction even though he had never met her before today, even though he was risking his own career by challenging decisions made by powerful people. Captain Chung added her voice to the argument, explaining what they had witnessed, how Phoenix had handled the emergency with capabilities that exceeded most pilots they knew, how the respect her name commanded proved she was someone special who had been wronged. Around them, passengers were recording everything on their phones, posting to social media about the banned pilot who saved their lives, creating a viral story that would force officials to answer questions about why someone this capable had been prohibited from flying. Within hours, news coverage exploded across every channel as the story spread. The banned female pilot whose legendary status was revealed when F-22 Raptor pilots spoke her name with reverence, the unjust restrictions that had tried to ground someone extraordinary, the emergency rescue that proved true capability couldn't be suppressed by politics or regulations. Military veterans called for investigations into how Phoenix Mitchell had been treated. Aviation experts analyzed her flying and declared it some of the best emergency piloting they had ever seen. Politicians who had been involved in her original case suddenly found themselves answering uncomfortable questions about whether they had destroyed a hero's career to protect their own reputations. And Sarah Mitchell, who had boarded that flight as a humiliated banned passenger under guard and suspicion, walked off as someone whose name now represented both injustice and vindication, both legendary achievement and wrongful persecution. The ban remained officially in place pending review, but everyone knew it wouldn't survive the public scrutiny and military support that had exploded in her defense. She had been denied the sky for 18 months, but in one emergency flight she had reclaimed her reputation and proved that legends don't disappear just because powerful people try to erase them. As she finally left the airport surrounded by supporters and military pilots who had driven hours to meet her, Sarah looked up at the sky where F-22s continued their training missions overhead, their contrails marking the air she had once commanded, the domain she had been forced to abandon. Major Harrison walked beside her, still arguing with Pentagon officials on his phone, demanding justice for someone he had known only through reputation until today but whose capabilities he had now witnessed firsthand. "They're going to restore your status," he said confidently. "They have to. The whole country is watching now. The whole military is behind you. You proved today that Phoenix Mitchell belongs in the sky." Sarah smiled slightly, thinking about the gate agent who had flagged her, the passengers who had judged her, the officials who had banned her, and how everything had changed the moment those F-22 pilots spoke her name with reverence. That couldn't be faked or dismissed. She had been banned from the sky by people who feared her capabilities, but she had returned through emergency and necessity, proving that true talent and courage couldn't be permanently grounded no matter what restrictions were imposed. Her name had been spoken by the best pilots in the world with respect that transformed perception instantly, and that respect had saved not just the passengers on Flight 237 but also her own future in the sky she was born to command. The story would continue for months as investigations proceeded, but first came the immediate aftermath that would change everything. As paramedics loaded Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Martinez into ambulances, both now stable and recovering from the hypoxia that had nearly killed them, airline executives gathered in a private airport office demanding answers about how their banned passenger had ended up saving their aircraft. Brian Foster, the gate supervisor who had treated Sarah with such suspicion just hours earlier, stood awkwardly in the corner looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor as his bosses demanded explanations. "You let a restricted passenger board one of our aircraft," the regional director snapped at Brian, his face red with anger and confusion. "A woman flagged in our security systems as prohibited from flying. And now we're hearing she's some kind of military hero. How did this happen? Why wasn't I informed?" Brian fumbled with his tablet, pulling up Sarah's file that showed the approved exemption paperwork alongside the restriction flags, trying to explain that everything had been done by the book even though the situation made no sense to anyone who didn't understand the classified politics behind her ban. Before Brian could stammer through another explanation, the office door opened and Major Harrison walked in still wearing his flight suit, his presence immediately commanding attention in a way that made the airline executives straighten their postures unconsciously. Behind him came Captain Chang and two other officers who had arrived from Offutt Air Force Base, their expressions serious and official. "Gentlemen, I'm Major Jake Harrison, United States Air Force," he announced with crisp authority. "I'm here to inform you that Captain Sarah Mitchell is under military protection pending a full review of her case by the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Any questions about her presence on your aircraft today should be directed through proper military channels, and I strongly suggest you focus on thanking her rather than questioning her." The regional director blinked in confusion, clearly unused to being told what to do in his own airport office, but something about Harrison's tone and the presence of multiple Air Force officers made him reconsider whatever objections he was planning to voice. "We're grateful she was able to help," he said carefully, his earlier anger deflating into cautious diplomacy. "But we still need to understand how someone on a federal restriction list ended up flying on our aircraft. Our insurance, our liability, our security protocols. Were all followed correctly," Harrison interrupted firmly. "Captain Mitchell had proper exemption paperwork approved through channels above your pay grade and mine. She boarded legally. What happened after that was an emergency that revealed truths some people would prefer to keep hidden, but those days are over. Captain Mitchell's name is being spoken by every fighter pilot in the Air Force right now, by every military aviator who understands what excellence looks like, and by a whole lot of civilians who just learned that sometimes the people we restrict and ban are exactly the people we need most." He let that statement hang in the air for a moment, then added quietly, "You should also know that the Secretary of Defense is currently on a call with your CEO explaining why Phoenix Mitchell deserves an apology, not an investigation." Sarah herself was in a different room being checked by paramedics who insisted on examining her despite her protests that she was fine, while Jessica the flight attendant sat beside her looking emotionally overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "I almost didn't let you help," Jessica said quietly, tears still drying on her face. "I saw those flags in the system and I thought. I don't know what I thought. That you were dangerous. That you had done something terrible. I never imagined you were someone who had saved lives, who had served your country, who had that kind of skill." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for how we treated you. For how I treated you." Sarah reached over and squeezed Jessica's hand gently, understanding that the flight attendant had simply been doing her job according to the rules she had been taught. "You did everything right," Sarah said kindly. "Those security protocols exist for good reasons. You weren't wrong to be cautious. The system was wrong for flagging me the way it did, but you were just following procedures. What matters is that when it counted, when lives were at stake, you trusted me enough to let me help. That took courage." Jessica nodded but still looked haunted by the memory of seeing Sarah denied boarding, of monitoring her like a criminal, of not recognizing that the banned passenger was actually someone extraordinary. Outside in the terminal, news crews were setting up cameras and reporters were interviewing passengers from Flight 237, each person eager to tell their version of the dramatic story. The young woman who had asked her mother why that lady couldn't fly was now excitedly explaining to CNN cameras that the lady had actually been a super amazing pilot who saved everyone. The businessman who had made dismissive comments about aviation enthusiasts was sheepishly admitting he had completely misjudged the situation. One passenger after another described the terror of hearing the captain announce a medical emergency, the confusion when a banned passenger went to the cockpit, and then the shock of hearing F-22 pilots speak her name with such profound respect that everything suddenly made sense. When that fighter pilot said, "Phoenix Mitchell is cleared for immediate cockpit access with full authority," the way he said it with such reverence and certainty, we all knew something huge was happening, one passenger told NBC News. Then people started searching her name on their phones and finding these incredible stories about missions she flew, lives she saved, and we realized the person they had made sit in the back of the plane under guard was actually a legend. It was surreal and powerful and honestly made me question everything about how we treat people based on what computers tell us without knowing their real stories. Social media exploded with the story as videos recorded by passengers spread across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, the hashtags #PhoenixMitchell and #BannedHero. Trending worldwide within hours. Military veterans from all branches of service began sharing their own stories about hearing legends of Phoenix Mitchell during their service, missions where her tactical decisions had created protocols that saved lives years later, training programs she had developed that made pilots safer and more effective. One retired general posted a long thread explaining the classified mission that had led to her ban, carefully avoiding details that remained secret but making clear that Sarah had been punished for being too good at her job, for saving lives in ways that embarrassed commanders who had made poor decisions from comfortable offices thousands of miles from danger. The Pentagon found itself under intense pressure from both military members and civilians demanding answers about why someone with Sarah's record and capabilities had been banned from aviation. Congressional representatives started making calls asking pointed questions about the investigation that had ended her career. Aviation industry leaders wanted to know why civilian databases had flagged someone whose skills clearly indicated she should be flying, not grounded. The story touched nerves about how bureaucracies sometimes punish excellence, how politics can override merit, how capable people get suppressed by systems that value conformity over competence. 3 days after the emergency landing, Sarah received a call from a number she recognized as coming from inside the Pentagon. A calm voice identified himself as General Marcus Hayes, the Air Force Chief of Staff, one of the most powerful officers in the entire military. "Captain Mitchell, I'm calling to inform you that your case has been reviewed at the highest levels following the events of Flight 237, he said formally. "The original investigation and subsequent restrictions placed on your aviation status have been found to be based on political considerations rather than legitimate safety or regulatory concerns. Your ban is being officially lifted effective immediately, with full restoration of all ratings and qualifications. Additionally, you're being offered reinstatement to active duty with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel if you choose to return, or full clearance for any civilian aviation position you wish to pursue." Sarah sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing words she had stopped believing she would ever hear. "Sir, thank you," she managed to say, emotion making her voice unsteady. "But what changed? Why now? These same people have been blocking any review of my case for 18 months. General Hayes was quiet for a moment before responding with brutal honesty that military officers rarely offered. "What changed is that you saved a commercial airliner full of civilians while the entire country watched, and in doing so you reminded everyone what real capability looks like," he said. "What changed is that F-22 pilots spoke your name with the kind of respect that can't be faked or dismissed, forcing people to confront the fact that maybe they had made a mistake. What changed is that sometimes injustice can only be corrected when it becomes too visible to ignore." He paused, then added more quietly, "For what it's worth, Captain, there were many of us who disagreed with what was done to you. But we were overruled by people who cared more about politics than pilots. I'm sorry it took a crisis to bring you justice." The formal ceremony restoring Sarah's flight status took place 2 weeks later at the same Air Force base where she had once commanded tactical operations, a symbolic choice that many people understood represented her coming home to where she belonged. Major Harrison and Captain Chong were there in dress uniforms, along with dozens of other F-22 pilots who had traveled from bases across the country to honor Phoenix Mitchell's return to the sky. The base commander presented her with new wings and certificates while cameras recorded everything, the military making a very public statement about correcting its mistakes and honoring someone who had been wronged. But the moment that moved Sarah to tears came when a group of young female pilots approached her after the ceremony, their eyes shining with admiration and hope. "Captain Mitchell, we all grew up hearing stories about Phoenix," one young lieutenant said. "About the first woman to command fighter squadrons in combat, about missions that seemed impossible but you made them work. When we heard you had been banned, it felt like they were trying to erase everything you represented. But you came back. You proved they couldn't suppress real excellence. You showed us that even when systems fail us, our capabilities remain. Thank you for not giving up, for being there when people needed you, for proving that legends are real. Sarah hugged each of them, understanding that her story had become bigger than just her own vindication, that young aviators saw in her journey a message about perseverance and capability transcending unjust obstacles. She thought about sitting in seat 38F just weeks earlier, humiliated and banned, wondering if she would ever fly again. She thought about the moment when everything changed, when Harrison's voice spoke her call sign with such reverence that doors literally opened and perceptions transformed. And she understood that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in cockpits over hostile territory but in moments when truth confronts injustice and capability prove stronger than politics. The airline that had monitored her as a threat offered her a position as a training captain, a role where she could teach others the skills that had saved Flight 237. Military contractors wanted her to test their newest aircraft designs. Universities asked her to speak about leadership and decision-making under pressure. But Sarah took her time deciding what came next, savoring the freedom of having choices again, of being recognized for her real achievements rather than defined by unjust restrictions. She visited Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Martinez in the hospital, both recovering well and insisting they owed her their lives, though Sarah deflected the praise as she always did, insisting they had simply experienced bad luck with equipment failure and she had merely been available to help. 6 months after Flight 237's emergency landing, Sarah found herself back in an F-22 cockpit as part of a special evaluation flight, her hands on the controls of the most advanced fighter jet in the world, the aircraft whose pilots had spoken her name and changed everything. Major Harrison flew as her wingman, the two of them executing tactical maneuvers over empty airspace while Sarah rediscovered the pure joy of flying at speeds and capabilities that commercial aviation could never match. When they landed and climbed out of their jets, Harrison saluted her with genuine respect that had grown from professional admiration into real friendship. "Welcome home, Phoenix," he said simply. "The sky missed you." And Sarah smiled, looking up at the vast blue expanse that had been denied to her for so long but had called her back when she was needed most, understanding finally that true capability could be suppressed temporarily but never destroyed, that excellence recognized by those who understand it transcends any ban or restriction, and that sometimes the most powerful words ever spoken are simply a call sign said with respect by pilots who know what that name really means. She had been banned from the sky, but the sky had refused to let her go, and now she flew again not despite the injustice she had faced but strengthened by it, proved by it, vindicated by it in ways that made her story a legend that would inspire aviators for generations to come. The ban had tried to ground Phoenix Mitchell, but legends don't stay grounded, not when their names are spoken by the best pilots in the world, not when their capabilities save lives, not when truth finally overcomes politics and excellence proves stronger than any restriction imposed by those who fear it. She had returned to the sky, and this time nothing would force her back to the ground.